Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Alan Sarhan. I'm a partner and member of DLA Piper Canada's Corporate Crime Compliance and Investigations Group. Based in Montreal, I regularly advise national and international clients on compliance program development, anti-corruption matters, corporate investigations, modern slavery, export control, and economic sanctions. As part of that, we do a lot of third-party due diligence, and we're very pleased to welcome you today to this unique webinar in what one of our panelists just called a very hot topic, which I agree with. I'll be moderating this roundtable discussion with two seasoned and talented compliance professionals. The webinar will cover a wide range of topics relating to third-party due diligence, including in the context of sanctions compliance, corruption compliance, supply chain risks, mitigating reputational harm, and other legal considerations. We'll discuss due diligence best practices, emerging trends, and strategies to navigate the complex regulatory environment that we are in. During the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box. Send your questions to the panel members, and time permitting, we will address them live. If not, we will address them following the presentation. We've got a lot to cover, so let me start by introducing my guest. First off, we have Amine Antari, partner with KPMG Morocco, who's leading the establishment of a delivery center for KPMG Canada. Most recently, Amine was the managing director and head of the Middle East at a major corporate investigations firm, where he led their forensic and investigation practice based in Dubai, UAE, and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Prior to that, Amine was the head of compliance investigations at SNC-Lavalin. Throughout his career, Amine has led a number of cross-border investigations involving multilateral development banks, as well as governmental and private sector entities across the globe. In addition, he specializes in assisting clients with their due diligence engagements, compliance consulting mandates, and AML initiatives. He started his career in 2005 with a major consulting firm based here in Montreal in internal audit and forensics. Welcome, Amine. Next, we have Daniel Hartnett.
Yeah.
Daniel is a director of Refinitiv's third-party risk intelligence business, where he's responsible for the strategy and development of their third-party risk management solutions, such as WorldCheck, which I'm sure many of you have heard of or used. He works on enhanced due diligence reporting, third-party onboarding platforms, and managed services. Prior to joining Refinitiv, Dan worked for a large due diligence and corporate investigations firm where he helped several Fortune 500 companies identify and manage their third-party risks around the globe. He began his career in the U.S. Army, ultimately serving as a senior advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense and U.S. Congress, where he worked on national security and supply chain issues in the APAC region. Dan has a BA in Chinese Mandarin and an MA in Asian Studies. Just a quick reminder that the views and opinions expressed here today are the views of the panelists themselves in their capacity as experienced compliance professionals and not intended to represent the views of their respective organizations. So very clearly a talented bunch. Thank you, gentlemen, and let's get into it. Let's start at the very beginning. When we talk about third-party due diligence, what are we actually saying? What do we mean by third-party? Dan, would you like to kick us off with that?
Yeah, sure. So hello to all of our audience out there. So it's a great question, and it's one that's actually, I think, increasingly confusing out there because the historical or legacy term third-party risk had a very legalistic term to it, right? It meant those immediate counterparties, whether it be like, your supplier, your immediate supplier, or maybe your immediate distributor, right? So one step up or one step down in your supply chain, if you will. Recent years, though, it's kind of gotten a little bit more amorphous, where it's taken on, a couple of different terms. So it depends on who you ask, right? That core meaning is still there, but a lot of people started throwing it, including ourselves, actually, throwing it in what we would call fourth parties or fifth or nth parties, right? So deeper into the supply chain. So it no longer means those immediate counterparties, but maybe your supplier's supplier, for example, or your distributor's distributor, right? More so on the upside, right? That's where we find more risks, generally speaking, but it doesn't have to be there. But it has taken on that more amorphous terminology here. So when I use the term, I'm still primarily talking about immediate counterparties, but I don't necessarily disregard or ignore any kind of entities, particularly if they're major suppliers or sub suppliers. You still want to kind of at least keep an eye on them as well on this rubric of third party.
Thank you, Dan. Amine?
So I think, look, I think I agree with Dan in terms of the definition, and I think it ranges as well from region to region in terms of specificities and maybe some type of third parties are being included where maybe in other jurisdiction it's not the case. So when we talk about I think to Dan's point, third party due diligence, I mean the due diligence purpose is to mitigate the third party risk, and I think it's one way among others to mitigate that risk, and it can ranges from desktop research, quick internet look up to a full-blown investigation with due diligence, and I think we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But I think to whatever the definition of third party is, I think the controls that you're putting in place to mitigate that risk are key and important.
Thanks, Amine. And I'd want to emphasize, I agree with what both of you have said. I think for an organization, from the organizational perspective, you do have to come to some landing as to what that term means. So it means a lot of things, but if you're going to implement an operating procedure, if you're going to have a process, I think within the organization, you have to have a very clear definition. So is it that third party? Is it that fourth party? Are you limiting it to government touch points? Are you limiting it to a far broader definition? So when it comes time to put pen to paper, I do believe that you should have a clear definition for that organization, and it could differ across organizations that have a different risk profiles. Again, remembering that the objectives are to mitigate risk, to mitigate legal risk, to mitigate reputational risk. So there is no one specific answer, but the objective is the same. If we can get into what due diligence is precisely, like practically speaking, how is it done? What do you start with? Dan, can you take us through your process?
Yeah, I mean, due diligence is a huge term, right? It means a lot more than just third party risk in many ways. But for me, for when we talk about third party due diligence or third party risk due diligence, really what you're looking to find out and then mitigate, as Amin said, any kind of harm that that entity or individual, if you're working with a LLC, for example, or something like that, may cause to your company. And what do I mean by harm? I don't necessarily mean physical harm, although that's also a possibility, of course, but really harm of kind of either this, legal, regulatory, financial, or reputational harm, right? Will they do something that you may not approve of, or will your customers not approve of, or will the regulators not approve of? Are they sanctioned entity? Are they owned by sanctioned entities, right? So you're peeling away these layers of the onion, if you want to use that analogy, to try and understand a little more about who that business partner is, who that the entity is, and whether there's anything there that again may undermine your firm's success going forward. And it varies, right? And I mean, I already touched upon this a little bit here. It varies by region, so the risk will vary by region. But you want to try and cover those, so you know them ahead of time. So you're going to put either controls in place, right? So you manage that risk, right? You understand it's there and it's an acceptable risk, but you got controls in place to minimize its impact. Or if the risks are too large, then you walk away from that relationship, right? There are some risks where you just we can't take this on, but not knowing is not an excuse for the most part, right? You have to have that understanding ahead of time. And as I mean, Ted, and we'll talk about it in a little while here, there are a lot of different tools and ways to do that ultimately, right?
And so, I mean, how do you know you're capturing your third parties appropriately within an organization?
So I think and to add to what Dan said, I think it's important at the beginning to have done a risk assessment and make sure that you are including all the third parties based on the definition and assessing a risk depending again on your risk appetite. But having a global and complete idea and perspective on the third parties. It could apply in a different setting. So, the standard would be transaction M&A. It could be also in engaging with a BD consultant, an agent, or a third party. But I've seen it in certain occasion, or and I can give maybe two examples of that. I've seen due diligence being required during the onboarding of high net worth individual by international banks, and how thorough that due diligence can be, especially on the source of funds. I've seen it also. There are several citizenship programs around the world allowing and giving, based on certain criteria, citizenship to people, send kids and other, without naming all the countries that have those programs. But this is also, an exception, a particular instance where you would see that due diligence being required, different from your usual, transactional, or you're hiring an employee, or you are engaging with a third party. So I think several ways, and the due diligence would differ depending on the purpose of the relationship, but also on the risk profile of that third party.
Thanks. I mean, I think that's important when you mention the risk assessment and the context in which you operate, right? Operating in the financial services business, or very high transaction type business, I think requires a very different capture point, which is more transaction based, versus say operating in the industrial space where you're looking at new market entry, for example. So you've only operated in Canada and the United States for decades, and now suddenly you're looking to move to Africa. So perhaps you don't have a well-honed third-party due diligence process, just because your risk profile, the organizational risk profile, is low, and now you're leaping out into another jurisdiction that you're not used to. You need to make that adjustment. You can't assume that things operate in the same manner. So I think it's about doing those verifications, and it's about very importantly, not isolating the process within a small group in the organization. Dan, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so as third-party risk and the topologies, the types of risk, right, have expanded, right? Originally we looked at, bribery and corruption as being one of the original ones, but now we're seeing more specialized things, cyber risk or ESG risk, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, right? And there are other ones out there as well that all fall under this rubric of third-party risk. But as that term has kind of gotten broader and more topologies have come in, it became fractured and siloed, right? So the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, might have owned cybersecurity risk, right? And the compliance officer traditionally owns the bribery and corruption risk. ESG risk was, who knows where that's at, right? Yet in a third part of the organization, and they weren't often communicating. And for many firms, they still aren't communicating as well as they should be. And that leads to a lot of problems where maybe a risk would have been detected or was even detected in this part of the firm for that third party, but was never relayed to others so they can actually act upon it. And so I think the more advanced players here, the ones who have put a lot of effort and time into it, starting to think about, okay, how can we coordinate across these various silos in our organization? And I'll be the first to admit, silo busting or working a lot, especially a larger organization, is challenging. It's very, very difficult. But I think that the changing environment necessitates that. You have to do this. Otherwise, you're going to trip yourself up, because a known risk, or what may have been a known risk over here in this part of the organization, wasn't communicated to someone else. And therefore, you continue to engage with that third party at a level that maybe you should not have been, or maybe controls were not put in place they should have been put in control. And so coming at it from this more, almost like a centralized function, if you will, at least from an oversight perspective, I think is increasingly critical.
I like that. I like that silo busting notion, and you say centralized. It's almost centralized, but but we have to be careful when we say centralized, because people have the tendency within organizations to be like, oh, well, that's centralized with compliance. It's not my problem.
Mhm.
So centralized, but at the same time, you have to educate cross-function and make
Yes,
sure that the business people understand that this is very much their problem. Anyone who's worked in this compliance space understands that tension.
yep,
You know, commercial will want to go to compliance and sort of get them to sign off on something, oftentimes at the 11th hour. But that's not, if it's not appropriately embedded within the commercial teams, you can, one, you can create even more tension. Compliance becomes a nuisance, just
yep,
another step that needs to be done, and that will be, you know, result in delays to a deal, a closing. Whereas the importance
right.
of
Inhibiting
embedding
business, right? Is the
it,
term we hear a lot of,
the,
unfortunately. Yeah.
the business prevention unit. I've heard that term uh,
Yep.
thrown around before. So how do you avoid being labeled the business prevention unit? You partner early. You
Mhm.
implement policies and standard operating procedures. I know every organization has enough policies, and you know, they don't need more red tape. You have to be nimble, but there still needs to be rules. And so I think clearly articulated rules, but more importantly, the actual standard operating procedure that goes with those rules. A lot of times I'll see business partner policies without any process. So you're leaving people a little bit in a lurch to work things out on their own. You need business partner questionnaires, both internally and perhaps in a higher risk situation that are shared with the third party. Ongoing monitoring, um, background checks, consistent data collection. These are aspects that you typically see in a well designed program. So moving on, I mean, what organizations should this apply to? Are we speaking to everybody? Now, there are a number of guests here. Some of them are major global organizations, and others are startups. Who does this third party due diligence apply to?
I think, Alan, it applies to any, at least from my side, any organization that is will engage with a third party. And when we think about third parties, we're talking about, you know, in general as a standard, could be a supplier, could be a consultant, could be a service provider. But I think we're starting to include clients, intermediaries as well in the whole definition. And we talked about the definition of third party, and I don't want to go into that as well. But for me, it applies to organization based on certain events, and I mentioned some example events where the due diligence is required, but organization have to have processes and policies in place to tackle that risk, third party risk. And it's not only to have them, but actually they are operating, working, and understood by all the involved parties. I've seen several examples of cases where policies are not known to people that should apply it. And especially, you know, we were talking about centralized earlier. The more you leave the headquarter and you get far from it, the less understanding is there. But to the contrary, the higher is the risk because there is less knowledge, and probably in the region that are you know far from the headquarter, there is a higher risk to the business and to the organization.
Dan, any thoughts on that, on the who this applies to? And
No, I mean, summarize it perfectly, right? In theory, applies to everyone, right? At the end of the day, the regulators don't look at it and from a certain size of a enterprise or a certain geographic footprint of an enterprise or anything like that at all, right? Just whether you've done due diligence. The level of due diligence you might do may change based upon your size, based on your reach, and based upon your resources, right? Um, but in theory, it's just good business practice at the end of the day to be doing some level of due diligence on your counterparties to make sure that you're not somehow swept up in some kind of issue that you walked into inadvertently, right? Because that's when the regulators see that nothing was done, that's when the heat comes down, unfortunately.
And I think that brings us back again to the risk of sounding like a broken record, the risk assessment and understanding your own organizational environment. If you're an organization that is very M&A active, right, your due diligence becomes systematic due diligence into your target. If you are in the not-for-profit space and you're dealing with a lot of charitable donations, it's a very, very complicated space to work in. How do you manage donations, where that's going, ensuring the funds don't fall in the wrong hands, don't violate sanctions, don't violate uh, uh, anti-terrorism laws. Real estate, another huge AML risk, right? If you are looking to loan money, to lend money to construction projects or real estate, it's another very sort of specific risk profile. So I think it's always about understanding organizations, and as much as the external advisors like ourselves can help, I think the people that know they're organized the best are those who are embedded, who are within, and then you can articulate that if you need outside help, but the real experts are those who are closest to the business. Um, let's move on to the current regulatory environment. It seems like uh, every every month there's something new geopolitically. There's something new, and that's creating a really difficult environment, I think, for organizations to operate in. Why is third party now due diligence more crucial than ever, given the current climate that we live in? Dan, sorry.
Wasn't sure what that was for. I was like, oh, I can answer it,
Yeah.
but okay. So I think there's a couple of factors at play here, and why we're seeing these changes here. I mean, third-party risk, as I said, has always been there in some form or another, but it's not been that hot button issue that it is currently right now. I think first and foremost was a pandemic, right? In some ways, so maybe you can even say it began before the pandemic, but the pandemic really shed a light on the idea that companies really don't know who's in their supply chain. A lot of companies didn't even know and still don't know technically who's their immediate counterparties are. I mean, they know 40% of them, right? The ones that are brought in through procurement teams, right? The big ones. But they may not know whether small little business units, right, as Amine mentioned, further away from the headquarters, have a small little contract with another third party over here, unbeknownst to the central headquarters, right? And so you have that as being an issue there. That caught a lot of companies off guard during a pandemic. So that's number one there, why it's more important. And companies, I think, even to the board is actually understanding these now. I think at the same time, a lot of the issues from a consumer activist angle, right? So forced labor company, their buyers or consumers coming out against companies for reputational risk because there's forced labor somewhere in the supply chain, even if it's several layers removed and unbeknownst to the immediate company. That's another factor playing into effect here, right? Where you have this, because of social media, you have a lot more knowledge going around there, and the impact from a reputational damage is increasing. I would say drastically, and I would almost argue that for certain instances, and I keep coming back to forced labor, that may actually be more damaging from a reputational risk perspective than it is actually from a regulatory fine perspective, if you think about it. Particularly if there is any kind of evidence of willful negligence, right? And then the last thing you want to have is your company's name tarnished because of something that happened, several levels removed from you and everything due to forced labor. That causes a lot of damage. And so we're seeing that come into effect there. And then the interaction effect, I think, between the growth of these regulations, and you said they're all over the place, right? They're in the US. Canada's got one coming online on January 1st, I believe. The EU's got one. Germany's got one. Rinse and repeat here, unfortunately. There are so many more regulations that interact with that consumer activism, this consumer knowledge, that as people find out more stuff, they clamor for more regulations. Regulations uncover more fines, and it's highlighted in the media. The consumers advocate for more, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you just look at the past 20 20 or 30 years. A lot of this began through corruption. The FCPA really was, I think, that piece of legislation that got people's attention, heavy enforcement action by the DOJ and the SEC. But it took a while. There was a lag for that to catch on in other jurisdictions. And if you look at Canada as a perfect example, I still think enforcement is somewhat on the weaker side of things. But we're so much further ahead than we were, say, 10 years ago. And there's a convergence now. Like you say, there's modern slavery legislation. There's unprecedented use of sanctions. And I've always said it is somewhat different to be sanctioning a country like Myanmar versus a country like Russia, just by virtue of the number of commercial touch points. Russia is a major economy, and we've just seen in the past 2 years how many organizations have had to look within to say, like, well, wait, what kind of relationships do we have over there? And I think it's just the beginning. I think we're going to see more of that, not just in Canada, but abroad as well. And absolutely, consumer-facing companies are at a specific reputational risk. Sorry, were you going to say something? I mean,
Yeah, just to add maybe a perspective on the Middle East and Africa on two points. The one, and you mentioned enforcement, mostly in the US, North America, and Europe. But in the past, I would say 5 years, especially in the Middle East. So I'm speaking of the UAE and Saudi Arabia mainly. A lot more enforcement. We've been seeing a lot more enforcement. Penalties, fines on not only companies, but also imprisonment and fine on individuals. And the interesting thing is that that information is shared publicly on the newspaper. So they want also by doing that to become a deterrent to others. So that's on one end. On the other hand, there is a lot more scrutiny on investment. So that region, whether it's the Middle East or Africa, there is a lot more interest from international company to operate there, and therefore a lot more investment, whether private investment or institutional investment, and therefore, when you have the like of World Bank and other multi-development banks coming into a lot more now to invest in startups, in companies, in big projects. Well, certainly they do ask a lot more questions, and there is a more thorough monitoring that's happening. So there's no choice from those countries if they want to keep the FDI in to comply, and that means not at the government, only at the government level, but also at the company level as well. So yes, I think we're seeing a lot of changes and improvement. We're still far away from best practice, I would say, but we're getting there, I think, in those regions.
yeah. So I mean, I think we all agree that there'll be more than less in the short, midterm, and long run. And I think you cannot predict the regulatory landscape. You cannot predict new regulation, but what you can do is design a process and design procedures internally that can allow you to pivot and to adjust to new legislation. Back to Dan's point earlier, you can't have 3 groups within an organization running parallel due diligence processes. It's cumbersome. You're going to miss something. It's costly. So I think it's about streamlining and looking at it from a higher level, from a sort of first principles level, as opposed to reacting like, oh look, sanctions have just been laid on. Let's like scramble and figure out all of our relationships with respect to this one jurisdiction. That never works. It's really hard to pivot. I want to move on to a question here, or topic that comes up a lot. It's a practical sort of question that not all companies have the resources to conduct comprehensive and thorough due diligence. When I think about it, banks again are the example of that gold standard. They've got massive compliance teams, unlimited funding, heavily regulated businesses. So let's set them aside for a second. What tips can we provide to organizations that are really seeking to do more with less, not by choice, but just by that's their reality? Compliance is still a cost center. It will always be. Um, how do you do more with less? Dan?
So that's the $1 million question, so to say, right? Where you do, especially in this current environment, right, where we're seeing this economic uncertainty out there, and many companies are, scaling back their investments across the firm, and sometimes compliance is unfortunately one of those that gets hit, right, along with other operating entities. But at the end of the day, I think the risk-based approach is really key here, and you can't drive that term home enough, right? Risk-based approach. The regulators themselves have come out and said that's a best practice because we know that a one-size-fits-all does not work. We all live in a world of limited resources. You cannot go at it and think that every third party has to undergo the exact same process. They may go through the same process in the sense of we'll send out a questionnaire and we'll review the questionnaire and then figure out what level of due diligence. That's fine. But it should not be everyone gets this level of depth of a research, this frequently being monitored, this often being recertified. You'll go broke, in a matter of years, right? So you don't want that. You have to kind of, once you know your complete ecosystem of where your third parties are and who they are, you risk tier them. You put them in a couple categories, right? What are the most riskiest ones? What are the mid-tier ones? And what are the lowest tier ones? And then starting with those lowest tier ones, and how you define that will depend upon what size your firm is, where your firm's operating, what industry sector. So it's a couple factors have to be included there. But once you know who those lowest risk ones are, they may just be as simple as a screening, a quick little screening to make sure they're not on a sanctions list, for example, or they're known watch list, and that's it. Then you're off and running, right? And that should be, in theory, if you look at it from a percentage perspective, the vast majority of your third parties, right? Now, how many is a percentage number here? Maybe 60 to 70%, right? In a general sense of the term. Next tier is that medium tier. Well, maybe you then ratchet up and do a little bit more investigations on them. You might do a little bit more screening. Maybe you do it to a low level enhanced due diligence on them. You might monitor them slightly more frequently, right? That kind of the angles there. But again, you're coming at it in a tiered step approach here. It's those highest risk ones, maybe 5% of the average, third party ecosystem that's out there, right? Those are the ones that you save your resources for, and you do a little bit deeper dive on them because they ultimately, if something is wrong, they are the one that will have the biggest impact upon your business. And those are the ones that will give the highest scrutiny should the regulators unfortunately come knocking at your door. And those are the ones that you do a deeper due diligence dive on. Anything to, I said, enhanced due diligence report, to things that Amine was talking about before, right? Where you might go, on the ground site surveys or investigations there, or even deeper types of corporate investigations, right? So there's a whole spectrum of stuff you can do. But risk tiering it and that risk-based approach are what the regulators expect nowadays. And having a process in place like that, again, not perfect. No process is perfect, but it will help you for sure.
Amine, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think if I can add to what Dan has just said, and I think it's a very good summary in terms of what can be done and how can it be done. I think technology has been very helpful, not only for clients but also for service providers. So on both sides, I see investment into technology to automate certain processes, to get access to certain type of data, public data, and there are in certain regions. I mean, just if I take the Middle East, there are some countries in the Middle East where you can have access to litigation records, you can have access to corporate ownership freely or with a very, very small fee, but you need to know that and in order to access that information. So it's not opaque in the whole region, and there are ways in getting information with data, at a reasonable cost. I can give one last example on that using internal resources. So sometimes, you have qualified, competent, but most importantly, very networked individuals within the organizations that you can use to ask questions for them, to get information on the ground, to use them as a way to corroborate other information that you saw while doing the research, and so on. So I think there are ways for anybody to get a little bit more information than going and then paying big bucks or a significant fee to get a report at the end of the day. But I think there are ways to do it step by step at a reasonable cost and get sometimes the same the same results.
I was gonna say that exactly on internal expertise. I'm a big believer that you cannot outsource wholesale the risk mitigation with respect to third parties. Going back to what I said earlier, you know your organization best. You know where the touch points are. So assigning responsibility, and it doesn't have to be a full-time resource if that just doesn't fit your reality. But there needs to be dedicated person to compliance, to third party risk. There are a number of free or very inexpensive sources out there. Dan could speak to. I mean, Dan effectively will talk about the technology at your firm, but it's an aggregator of. There's some closed source aspects to it, but it's an aggregator of a lot of open source databases, whether it be OFAC sanctions lists or World Bank ineligibility lists. There's so much that out there that's free, that's inexpensive. Google and there are many opportunities for you to leverage what's out there. Perhaps designing requires a little bit of help. Understanding what already exists, like many organizations already do financial reports or financial stability reports that Dun and Bradstreet into their suppliers or partners. Why not at that instance onboard integrity, reputational due diligence at the very same time? Oftentimes you learn that, oh no, that's a different department. So it's about thinking through the design. We're see that we have got 20 minutes left and still lots to cover, so we'll move along. Get into more specific issues. Amine, could you talk us about addressing corruption risk, specifically what you've encountered and how there may be some specific considerations when dealing with corruption risk?
So if we use, let's say, the due diligence as a way of mitigating the corruption risk, and I think it allows for anybody to have answers to a variety of questions. So I'll give a few examples of that. So one, understanding, let's say you're doing a DD on a third party who's going to help you operate in Africa. You don't have any people headquarters there, of course, operations, and therefore you need help getting work, getting a business, and you would like to do a due diligence on it. So understanding how you're going to mitigate that corruption risk is understanding how that firm or that individual is operating within that market. What are the links that he or she has with authorities, with governmental officials? How long he's been with the business? Is he new and just opened his company? So understanding the way he does business and seeing whether that fits and align with your way of doing business. The second element is the reputation on the market. So as part of a due diligence process, you can ask questions on the ground, what we call source inquiries, and gaining a better understanding of their reputation. So when you speak to people within the business community who have interacted with that company, with the individual, they will provide some very interesting and quality information. Of course, you need to corroborate it to make sure that it's as true and as accurate as possible. But you'll be surprised how much information on some corruption issues or some ongoing issues in the background regarding that company that people can provide you with, because this information, for instance, you will not find it publicly. And the last element, which is I think important, and sometimes we forget to mention it, because we're just trying to find as much information as possible, is actually contextualizing that information. So sometimes you do research on a company, you find out that company is, and this is an example that I've faced in my past experience, a company who has been alleged of winning a contract after paying bribes to a government official. When you dig deeper and of course ask questions in two, because it was involving two jurisdictions, as well as obtaining more information from the third party, you can, at that point, you can clearly see that it's a vendetta, that actually they are putting his competitors have been doing bad press, and that there is no substance to that allegation. So I think it's important to keep that in mind in terms of, while you want to get as much information as you want to make you comfortable and protect you and of course the company and its shareholders, but at the same time getting that information will also serve to corroborate and give more context to issues, because you kind of, you know, when you find that type, it's a hot potato, so you need to manage it. And I think getting more information and understanding the background would help clarify that in a better manner.
I think that's really important about digging deeper. You know, a lot of the screening tools, and again, Dan, you could speak to this, may flag a certain concern or issue, or oftentimes one of the things that comes up, you'd see a PEP is flagged, politically exposed persons, for those of you who don't know the acronym, which in it of itself doesn't mean anything. Like, you have to understand what that is. Is that an employee of a crown corporation, or is it in fact a public official? So digging deeper, understanding what's behind the results is crucial. I'm going to briefly address just the sanctions due diligence as sort of a different aspect, right? There's list-based sanctions and there are non-list-based sanctions. Running your screening against the list, your job can't necessarily stop there. It depends on the objective, it depends on the risk appetite, but there's this notion of control that's defined very differently across different jurisdictions. So what does it mean? Are we in a jurisdiction where we have a 51% rule? In the US, there's tons of guidance on what that means. In Canada, for example, there are recent amendments that have helped us understand what the notion of control means, but still a lack of government guidance. In the UK, is sort of a different approach. So this is doing due diligence in conjunction with thorough legal analysis as to what the results actually mean. And that's a legal answer. Then there's a reputational risk. You know, are you getting close to someone that's on the list? Are there links there that suggest you know, that there may be a relationship, but the person you're dealing with is not in fact sanctioned, but there's a lot of adverse media press to suggest that there is a relationship? That's a risk appetite question, and perhaps less of a legal question. So it's really about not taking a one-size-fits-all approach and examining the issues before you, and then examining your in conjunction with the company's risk appetite. Do you go, no go? Maybe Dan, you want to address quickly modern slavery and how that's also somewhat different.
Yeah, to me, modern slavery has taken on a tour de force, unlike ESG was capable of doing of and by itself, right? So if you think about it, modern slavery falls under the the bucket of S, the social impact, if you will, from the ESG perspective, but it has far surpassed it, both in public attention as well as in regulatory scrutiny, right? And so many of the recent regulations that have a supply chain third party relevancy, EU Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. In America, we have the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, Prevention Act, sorry, UFLPA. As I said, Canada has its own Supply Chain Due Diligence Act coming on. All of those are really focused in some way or form on, at least in part, the forced labor aspect, right? Which some ways makes sense because of all the ESG issues. It is the most heinous out there from a human rights perspective, right? And so you're seeing these ones where they're coming with a bit of an extraterritoriality to it as well, right? So it's no longer just about, if you're domiciled in country X, then the regulations only care about what you're doing in that country. Well, these laws are changing that, and the UFLPA in America, for example, is really concerned about what's going on in your Chinese supply chain touch points, particularly those in the Xinjiang westernmost province. EU, German, the EU and the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Acts are similar, right? They're not necessarily concerned solely about what's going on within Germany or within the EU, but rather where it occurs up or down the supply chain globally, right? And so those angles there, but again, all of them forced labor, these more heinous acts, if you will, and they're causing a lot of challenges for companies because it's forcing us all to spend more resources looking deeper into that supply chain, right? That's that expansion that I talked about earlier, from immediate counterparty, right? Additional notion of third parties into fourth, fifth, or who knows how many tier parties there are at the end of the day. But these regs are increasingly holding the core company, if you will, at risk at the end of the day.
So it's about the context and really understanding the context.
Mm-hmm.
I want to discuss briefly the situation we've all encountered high risk situations, right? Where we're doing due diligence in what appears to be a difficult, sticky situation, difficult jurisdictions. The pressure of the world is on the compliance function, and it oftentimes it goes out to external counsel to advise in like, well, can we go ahead with this? Businesses are designed to do business and to make profit, and so you get a lot of pressure, and oftentimes some of the most lucrative contracts or deals are in difficult jurisdictions. That's why they're there. So what tips do we have for difficult, complex, high risk situations, taking the due diligence perhaps another level or two? Dan?
So in that case, that's what I generally do is I get on the phone and I call people like Amine, right, and bring him in to help out with support. We don't, so from my world perspective, my job and my focus, my business is on identifying the risks, right? It's harder for me to advise clients on what to do about that risk because at the end of the day, everyone's going to see that risk differently. They all have different risk tolerances, right? And so, but I think at the end of the day, if you really want to do some deeper dive due diligences, you need to kind of call in, the means of the world who have that experience because there are some very specialized skill sets that and there's a lot of things that can be done potentially that go far beyond, screening and, desktop research and everything. So defer to Amine better for that one, but there's absolutely a whole world of stuff that can be and should be done sometimes.
So I mean, Dan elegantly passed off the question to you.
Thanks, Dan.
See, it's a slide, man. That's how you do it, man.
It's a nice slide.
So I think, look, a few examples. One is a deep background check, or sometimes we call it an investigative background check. There are two main portions to that. There is the first part, which is desktop research, database, public domain information, which you can either use a service provider or you can get access to it directly. The second part, which is the part where you get a lot more information, qualitative information, not always based on evidence, because you're not going to be provided with a document necessarily, but it's what we call source inquiries. So I mentioned it earlier. Give you an example. For instance, in one of the transaction, there was a supplier who has provided their financials, and of course the client has taken it as it is and asked us as part of the due diligence process to look into it further. And one of the questions that you would ask through the source inquiries, so source inquiries, you would speak to suppliers, you would speak to former employees, you would speak to bankers, you would speak to people within that industry, that community that have information that can be used as part of that due diligence process. So we asked the question to several suppliers in this example, and they told us that they haven't been paid for more than a year. Some of them that they have issues, cash flow issues. But when you look at their balance sheet and their financials, they look great on paper. They even audited by a firm as well. So again, that in this case, it helped not only give comfort to the client and for the client to corroborate that information, but also, most importantly, it allowed the client to go back to that supplier or service provider and ask further questions. And ultimately, they didn't go ahead with the relationship. Another example, and I'll stop there. It's site visits. We always think site visits, yeah, it bears cost, there's traveling expenses and all of that, but to be honest with you, the cost is quite limited. We had an example where the company was trying to get an investment from a private equity, and they were saying that they have, series of factories and real estate properties a little bit everywhere. And we decided to, select a sample and do site visits. We found out that either those properties, where the factories real estate, either didn't exist, or it seems that they were owned by others, at least not as the description was provided, or in a very, very bad shape, which will impact its value at the end. This is at the beginning of process. Of course, you would have found out after that as you're going through the relationship, maybe that information, but it's too late in the process, and you'd rather do it or find out as early as possible so that you're not spending more money and wasting your time. So yes, we are called upon for those specific, sensitive, and complex situations. But I think there are several ways that can be done, covert or overt, to get access to more information and data.
I mean, I think the takeaway for me is the higher the risk, the deeper the dive, the deeper the due diligence required to demonstrate that reasonable due diligence was undertaken. In the very unfortunate situation where you have to answer questions about a relationship, you'd better hope that you have an appropriate level of due diligence and a good record that you're able to share. We've got 5 minutes left. Dan, you work for Refinitiv, which is a London Stock Exchange company, develops the industry standard screening tool. I'm not plugging, it's just true. There are others, but you use a tool that so many participants today, I'm sure, use. Can you discuss the role of technology, the limitations of the tool, and what you see, some of the buzzwords, AI, machine learning, coming down the pipeline that could change things?
Yeah, so I won't talk about the limitations of this tool specifically, because I'm sure there are no limitations, of course, right? But generally speaking, from a technology standpoint, this gets to what you were all talking about earlier, right? Where, sometimes you need that contextualization. Well, the other problem about information is sometimes there's too much out there, a lot of white noise. And for firms or companies that have smaller in-house resources, they don't have time to wade through everything, right? They obviously can't manually check, sanctions list. You'll be there for days and days and days trying to do that, right? And then obviously probably miss some sanctions out there. So automating those is the simplest way to go about doing stuff, right? And that's what one of our tools does, and other screening tools do as well, right? To be honest, yeah, that's the idea, because you can automate those searches. You can automate the monitoring of those searches as well, which is really critically important, because risk doesn't stop just because you've onboarded a third party. They may get sanctioned a year down the road, and you need to be aware of that so you can pull the plug on that relationship or put some controls in place. So that's one way that technology obviously comes in. It also comes in from getting rid of all of the adverse media, the kind of the white noise that I mentioned out there, that you're sifting through reams and reams, terabytes of information maybe, trying to find out, is there one article out there that where someone was accused of being corrupt, or of human rights abuses or something something like that, right? You don't want to lose that by throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So using these kind of machine learning and AI functionalities to kind of enhance the research processes so you can kind of, surface those in all the white noise that's out there. So that's another way technology comes in. The third one is for firms that have the resources, and it's not necessarily useful for everyone, is kind of like a vendor onboarding tool, right? To kind of automate the processes. So now you're not talking about the research per se. Now you're not talking about the sanction screening or like that, but rather the onboarding process, right? So creating a third-party profile, potentially doing a screening, and then pushing it over into a questionnaire, subsequent potentially due diligence. That process itself, a lot of administrative burden comes along with that, particularly as your third-party risk, third-party environment gets larger. You have to deal with those, right? And so unless you want to hire an army of people, then leveraging the various onboarding solutions that are out there are also useful. They are expensive, and so they don't always, work perfectly with your way of doing business. And so there are a little bit of a cost that come with that. But for the larger firms or those that have larger footprints, that is a way to help mitigate that, because you can't manage. You can manage 100 suppliers on an Excel file. If we're talking about 1,000, 5,000 or more, right? Your system breaks down. There's no way you can do that at the end of the day. Or again, you'd have to hire an army of people in order to manage that. The one biggest risk I see from technology is a lot of talk about how AI, the generative AI in particular, is going to, really change the due diligence process. I'm in the middle on that right now, and we could have a whole entire panel on just that alone. So I'll keep it short. But the bottom line is that I do think that those kind of cutting edge generative AI type tools can maybe help facilitate. But at the end of the day, you're still going to require the human in the middle to come in and make those hard decisions, right? At the end of the day, and we cannot be over reliant upon those solutions, at least until we've known that we really proved them to work effectively. Maybe someday in the future, but we're not. We're definitely not there yet, at least.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that answer. We're right up against the hour. A couple of quick takeaways I hope that the audience got: that do not ignore the risk. It will not just magically go away. Tackle it on early. Embed it in your existing processes. It's very difficult to manage this at the 11th hour. This is an ongoing and iterative process. Do not try and accomplish it all in 3 months. Just build something, and it's just that whole startup minimum viable product type concept. Start with something and build over time. Listen, it's been a pleasure having you both. It's really fun to be speaking with people who are so well versed in the topic. We can obviously go on and on. I hope the audience has appreciated this, and if there are any questions, please reach out to us directly. And I thank you all for your time. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Amine. This has been great.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
and
Alan.
thanks for having us. That was great.